So, yeah, my name is Owen Beitsch, and I am the Senior Director of the Economics Consulting Group at GAI Consultants. I've been in practice for about 35 years, and prior to moving into private practice, I had been the Chief Budget Officer for a large housing finance agency. Then went to work for a major accounting firm. So I do have a combination of public and private experience. And as a nod to some of the other people on the call who are also faculty members or have university affiliations, I am associated with the University of Central Florida Urban Planning Program, where I've been teaching land use law and real estate finance for planners. I mention the academic background because much of what I'm going to cover this afternoon is distilled from various courses that I've taught at the university as well as seminars that I've taught. I think I've attempted or have managed to cobble together a very short but hopefully useful presentation that I think planners can embrace and learn something, even though what we're covering here is intentionally broad and involves a lot of different aspects about real estate and real estate finance that are difficult to compress into 30 minutes. What I'm going to do, given the short time we have available, is quickly summarize a number of major takeaways. And that way, if we start to run out of time, I won't drill down onto all the more complex issues that I've put together here today. I think it would be a mistake not to be very clear about the role that planners fill in terms of certain policies that affect real estate finance, and real estate value. I want to sensitize all of our planners on the call that there are certain attributes of real estate as an asset class that are different from others. And I think it's worth talking about because those things do affect the way they are treated and really the way they are financed. I've put together some very simple planning and financial relationships that hopefully will invite some questions. And then I'd like to wrap up with some market observations and thoughts about policy that perhaps could also lend themselves to more discussion. Number one is that planners do that development is really a private function. It's driven by the marketplace, and the output is primarily the result of private activity. And as planners, we can influence a lot of conditions. We can help, but we can't really alter market conditions that are present. And then establishing certain planning or policy objectives is really a political function. So in some ways, whatever it is we're doing, the value may not necessarily be maximized for those that are participating. We are in an era of continuous disruption right now, and it's not just about real estate, it's really everything we're doing. Technology is very, very rapidly, and at least as far as the discussion we're going to have today, policy moves far more slowly than the market. And I think it would be very hard for anybody on the call to dispute that. So in a sense, we need flexibility, but we're always trying to play catch up and adjust our policies to things that are occurring all around us. And so that creates this obvious gap between policy that we may have in place and what in reality may be different but immediate needs. And of course, the market itself is changing at a phenomenal pace. And I want to emphasize that even though we see a lot of things occurring in the national marketplace, local market conditions are influenced but not necessarily set by these national conditions. All real estate functions and exchanges pretty much at the local level, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. As for the development industry, it's a really specialized profession, And what's odd about it is that there are absolutely no barriers to entry. Anyone can claim to be a developer. And at least it's been my own experience that with this fairly low barrier to entry, that very few of these developers then have experience with mixed use concepts, which are among the more expensive to either fund or finance, but are very popular with planners. So we're going to want to talk about that for a moment. What is a juxtaposition here is that while development itself has almost no barriers to entry, the people like us that often act as advisors to developers, we are well trained and we often perform very discrete technical functions that require a particular kind of education. So some of our planners may be lawyers, some of our planners may be also be engineers, some of them may be public finance specialists. These are skills that require extensive education and training, and they may be beyond what the developer he or she has themselves. As far as the financial industry is concerned, it too is specialized. There are certain groups, certain actors that are only involved in financing very particular specific types of facilities or activities. And every one of these facilities or activities, they have their own dynamics that will be considered as loans, whether they're short-term or long-term, are made. They certainly have to do with how those facilities are evaluated in terms of fitting into the portfolio of a lender. Depending on the nature of the lender and the circumstances, those people are looking for certain rates of return. And if a plan is neither financially rational or satisfies some of the considerations like rates of return, you can be reasonably assured that a default position here is that a private entrepreneur is not going to step into the fray. And it's in these situations where we can't accommodate a certain rate of return or meet the requirements of the lenders that the public sector is inclined to participate. What I think tends to be forgotten is that there are many parties to a financial decision. It's not just the developer and the local government who's going to approve what is built. We have the development, the developer, local government, we have the users, and then those who are actually providing the capital. And they have different perspective on how rules and regulations work together. And then we have the actual investment decision itself. No matter how attractive a development is, there are measures of investment quality that need to be considered. And development as an investment activity or an opportunity is constantly competing with other opportunities. What I think is a little bit unusual about real estate development is that, at least in my opinion, that the risk is greatest during the planning phase of a potential development to be implemented as land is acquired and a concept is arranged, because rarely is that going to be financed or funded with other people's money. So this upfront stage of planning, which is often where we are going to insert ourselves, provides the greatest exposure to a developer because it is money that he or she must have available. In our profession, we can mitigate that risk, but we can't eliminate it altogether. And one point I really want to emphasize, and I'm going to illustrate today, is that many planners have this mistaken belief that value and cost are equivalent. And value and cost are very different. And all of those differences together then come out and are reflected in what I would call the supportable concept. So, in a very traditional, way of looking at our resources that go into financing, of real estate, we have the traditional intersection of land, labor, and capital. And as far as I'm concerned, today's focus really is on capital because of its material influence on whatever development scheme may be. And as far as this intersection of disciplines that relate to development, on the left side are those that are financially or fundamentally represented by the people on this call. We're either in real estate finance planning, sometimes we stray into economic development, and there's some overlap in all of these. Although in many cities and other local governments today, real estate development has often come to mean economic development without considering what really the differences are. And as far as the subspecialties, we are going to be drawing on combinations of economics, geography, and for many planners, sociology, because we are concerned with how we shape our communities and to a lesser degree, I hate to use the words, but to a lesser degree, how we socially engineer our communities. So, now what is it about real estate? I already mentioned that there are a few barriers to entry, but I didn't mention that because of that, the industry itself is highly fragmented and there are many, many players. Um, it is a very illiquid type of asset, and each one, because of its location, because of the way it is financed or funded, because of its component parts, is literally unique. And because of that, it has to be considered from a development and finance standpoint as a particularly one-off situation. So what are some of these risk opportunities? It's long-term. The participants, the processes in those participants require technical training, as I've said. I think there is often the appearance of or the lack of appearance of transparency. And there are a lot of things that occur behind the scenes and outside the negotiating room that we don't really understand as planners, even though we might have input on them. As I've already said, transactions themselves can be highly technical. They can be highly complex, and they do require highly trained outside expertise, such as us and the profession we represent, to move them along. So the first comment I made was that planners often see price, cost, and value as equivalent, which they are not. And when value exceeds cost, we can expect to get investment capital to flow to a particular activity. When cost exceeds value, the capital is just going to disappear. Regardless of point one or point two, if there's no demand for that particular product, there really is no economic value. And when there is no true economic value, there may be costs that the public perceives necessary to absorb. And we, if we're working in the public sector, we may want to step in and recognize that gap. So this is for me an illustration because I literally just went through this. So this is a 99 Miata, which is a great car. If you were to look on Edmunds or any website, you would see that if you're lucky, it might be worth about 2,900 bucks. I find it interesting to think about these cars as entry-level race cars. And to make that conversion from this inexpensive Miata, it's probably going to cost $2,000 or $3,000 to get the car prepped, to get it outfitted so that even on a slow-moving track, you can treat it as a race car. But here's the irony, is even though it has cost me $5,700 to transform this otherwise ordinary Miata into a track vehicle, oddly enough, if you were to go look on Edmunds, it's still worth about 2,900 bucks. So there is this obvious disconnect then between an adjusted value and what it really costs me to create something. I could put a paint job on this and forget the track modifications, but a green, newly painted Miata is only going to be worth slightly more than the otherwise unupdated Miata. So value and cost are not the same thing. And that sometimes creates a dilemma as we try to understand what a particular project might be or what it could be. Um, what are the measures of investment quality that we look at? There's a lot of them. This is not necessarily an exclusive list, but from an investment and a developer standpoint, I'm not only looking at income, I'm looking at the certainty I'm going to receive that income. I want to know when the returns are going to be timed because I have front end risk and continuing risk. I want to know if I have leverage, how much of my own money do I need to invest, and I want to know how I can get out of it. And I want all of these things on this list if I can have them while preserving the most liquidity. Is any single real estate development give me all of these things? Yeah, probably not. But this is the pool of conditions and the pool of variables I'm going to be looking at as I make my financing decision. So in real estate, we have this notion of a risk-free return. This slide is a little bit older, but I think it's probably still true with real estate at the top being a little perhaps suspect. But historically, a risk-free rate of return was associated pretty much with treasury bills. And then we have this increasing level of risk with obviously, no matter how you measure it, real estate being at the top. And if I, as an investor, cannot exceed that risk-free rate, uh, then I don't know that I need to be involved in that activity. So if I can't get this increasing return, then I'm probably going to abdicate and remove myself from either participating or funding a specific type of real estate activity. So this is my metric. Um, so bottom line, simple statement is developers, investors have choices, and we have to move if we're going to be funding something in the same direction as competing returns. I don't know that these are the exact numbers that one would embrace today. Treasury bills are going a little bit higher than this, but I think you get some idea of what the relative comparison is. We have our typical inflation measure, the CPI. We have passbook savings accounts. We have treasury bills, which is usually for me the point at which I consider the safe rate. And this too is an older slide, but I think it still illustrates what one does with that information. I think it shows pretty clearly how an investor might look at what we call an internal rate of return, which is way beyond the topic of today. But just in terms of simple percentages, if I am an investor buying an existing project, I'm kind of on the lower end of a rate of return. Why? Because I see what I'm buying. I know what needs to be improved. I know what risk I'm probably taking on. For the most part, I know what my unknowns are and how I might position myself in that property. Land development, as you can see here, regardless of what it is you're going to implement on a parcel, is probably the most risky. So despite the comparison between infill opportunities and greenfield, certainly in Florida, Washington, Oregon, California, where we are in an intensely regulated environment, land development is going to give me pause because it's going to be long-term in order to extract what my investment is going to be, and it's going to subject me to the most scrutiny. I put this at the bottom because I think that many people on the call might be interested in how we look at this notion of so-called public-private partnerships. They are anything other than a risk-free opportunity. And you can compare a public project on this list to an existing project, which, at least in my opinion, is going to require a much higher rate of return to satisfy the needs of my vocal, if not directly invested, public partner. So we've already talked about value and cost not being equivalent. I don't know that I need to focus on that with a further emphasis, other than to say a deal will take many different forms depending on how we address this value and cost dilemma. This is a very, very simple comparison of the starting point. We have how much I can sell an asset for versus what it costs me to develop it. And what it costs to develop it, or the net of that, yields what I call the residual, and an appraiser would consider the residual land value. And those costs of development, depending on where you are, they can be extensive. They include this full list of things off on the right, but anything I can sell in excess of that cost to create it stands for a particular proposition. I have to extract my profit from how I position and price the land. And I can't afford to pay any more than that residual land value, or I wind up in this lost position, as you'll see in a couple of examples that I've put together. If you participated in the housing supply accelerator discussion, you heard my comments about the real estate industry having its own ecosystem, and clearly it does. I mean, there are a million participants in the deal, and where they participate begins to shape what their needs are and what their particular expectations will be. And some of the participants can play multiple roles. I myself, as well as being a consultant, I'm also a broker. I am also a land developer. I'm an investor in a couple of other subdivisions. So you can wear many hats. They can all be in the same deal. They can be in different deals. But it's not just a developer, regulator, lender type of activities, much more complex. And that complexity, without getting into this PERT chart, begins to talk about how all of these parts come together. And what they focus on is just some reasonable expectation of what that asset value is going to be in the lower quadrant, and the ability of the capital markets to somehow plug into the value of that asset market. And all of these things are what various consultants will be looking at to help a developer, realize his project. I put together some very simple hypotheticals here, because there's this notion that all activity is the same, it all costs the same to build, and it all yields the same value. But as you can see here, before we look at it any differently, we have this idea of very low-rise, low-density construction, which is fundamentally wood frame and surface. We have a slightly higher density, from 3 to 6 stories. It's going to be wood. There's typically going to be some podium parking tucked underneath. And then we have this high-rise, which is all steel and concrete and structured parking. That's the range, and it plays itself out in many different ways. But as density increases, the price per square foot for all of these different things increases. So while I may have more units here, I've probably paid more for the land. I've certainly paid more to have them constructed. So density is sometimes my friend, but not always. And depending on which of those intensities or densities we're implementing, we can absorb a certain amount of land costs. And what I'm trying to show here is among different types of uses, how flexible or inflexible land prices can be in order to accommodate them. So I'm going to go all the way to the right and talk about industrial for the moment, or just a moment, because industrial probably has the most limited land price flexibility you have. The market between a high rent and a low rent, between a high cost and a low cost, is very, very narrow. So if I'm going to absorb land cost in these models for industrial land, I don't have a lot of room to maneuver. Whereas on the extreme left, depending on what my mixed use concept is, I have the potential to absorb much more land costs. I can allocate that land cost among my residential component. If I have a strong office market, I can shift some of that cost there. And that plays out across these different prototypes. But they're very, very generalized, and certainly there are exceptions to what I'm putting here. But the bottom line is, depending on the concept and the use, I have greater or lesser latitude to satisfy that earlier residual land cost calculation. These projects are all going to be worth different amounts of money. I can afford to pay different amounts of money for the land that's associated with it. I've already mentioned that density may not necessarily yield improved costs. I don't think I need to delve into why density is not necessarily a developer's dream. We have primarily the cost of improving and intensifying the structure and the nature of materials, and we can come back to that if people have questions. This is a very complicated slide, and if you look quickly at where I've circled some things in red, you'll see generally the kinds of density that I can support in an acre with a different type of construction. And each of these is typically caught inside the zoning categories as simply just this: medium density, low density, or high density. And in reality, the barriers that will be crossed, depending on what the particulars are in your land development codes, are very suggestive of what I can and can't do with that density. And one thing that I don't want is I don't want a bonus, I don't want support, I don't want assistance that will push me only slightly into the next highest form of construction cost. So if I can only get 45 units to an acre, I'm probably not interested in medium density. If I can get 65 units per acre, then I'm probably interested in medium density. But at 40, relative to low density at 35 units an acre, I'm not too excited about it. And I hope that I've explained why, basically. Concepts, older prices to put them together. I don't know that you could do it for these numbers, but when I put it together, these were very typical, and it shows, kind of the difference in construction that needs to be satisfied and the kind of density or intensity that needs to be realized in order to make them work. I am not going to go through each of these scenarios, except to say that in this situation, if I'm really going to max out that density, I need at least 70 units to an acre to make it work. And at that number, I can probably begin to lower the price of my product, even perhaps lower than at a low density product, maybe selling these units that I've modeled here for $360,000. So at 60 units to an acre, I can't really make things work. But at 70 units per acre, I can, and I can actually compete with less intensity. Lest we believe that all things are equal, I've quickly done a financial analysis to compare an office, retail, and an apartment building. In blue, or in red and blue, you see how much the effective gross income would be. And you see other numbers that I've printed out here. At the time I did this, it would have said that we would have had an estimated market value for office buildings of about 8.5 million, for a retail center of about 9.8, and for an apartment building of 5.4. In all of these cases, I've modeled them so that the development cost and the size of the structure are about the same. But in two of them, they will pencil out. One of them, the apartment building, won't pencil out at all. And in this particular example, given very similar square feet on the identical acreage, the retail or the office are the most attractive to me. Perhaps the greatest opportunity here is for office. It's worth the most, or it's worth a lot, and the land value is less. They have more flexibility in the retail center. So this is typically the way we would parse out loan to value relationships. Are these always true? Not really, but they are a guideline. If I'm going to make a loan on raw land, I'm never going to give you more than 40% of the value. If I'm engaged in land development where I'm accelerating or improving the quality of that raw land, I may give you as a lender 60% and so on, down to improved properties where I'm going to give you 85%, which is back to why my rate of return is also can be satisfied with greater certainty because I'm borrowing more money and I have less of my own capital to invest. Timing is very important. And this is the way I would tend to think about the way cost is allocated. We have this pre-development stage when risk is high, and that may represent 5 to 15% of my budget. I have the development period, 80 to 90%. And if I'm in the leasing or sales mode, 5 to 8%. Well, what's the significance of that? It's really, I want to make sure. Okay. So let's get down to this. So in that first period, it may take me 6 months to deal with that pre-development act, acquiring the land and do my due diligence. So in those subsequent or sequential 6-month periods, all my money is going out the door. Depending on the jurisdiction, entitlements could easily run from 12 to 24 months. Money is going out. On the construction side, money is going in. So as you can see from this time chart, it can be anywhere from 60 to 80 months before money is actually coming in to offset this series of very high costs that I'm showing here. And what's interesting is I might be able to borrow money for the development. I probably cannot borrow money for the pre-development. So these periods where money is going out the door are difficult for me. And ultimately this comes to 100% of the cost, money going out. So where does this all take us in this very short real estate course? Mixed use is probably the most difficult of all of these to do. Few developers have real experience in doing them. So that despite the fact they can absorb a lot of land costs, they're often extremely risky, and most of the time they conflict with zoning. So the whole regulation and approval process becomes problematic. We all want good design, but from the developer side, unless he's nudged a little bit, it's going to be frequently perceived as being a costly addition to what that design may be. That can be subjective. I spent a lot of time talking about density, and unlike design, it objectively is frequently more costly. On the participants in the decision about how money is spent, where it's allocated, there's many different constituencies to satisfy. If you were part of the Accelerator Playbook conversation, you heard my discourse on the constituencies, especially as it relates to parking. Planners want and are willing to provide less parking. Developers sometimes think that's attractive, but their users may not want less parking. So, how do we actually address that? And as far as housing is concerned, density seems to be resisted pretty much in the ownership form of housing. We've accepted it readily for rentals. It's time to have this further conversation about whether the ownership model or some other vehicle needs to be the desired norm for our culture and practices. We're critical of developers, but as you can see from all the slides, they have lots of decisions to make. And at least in their minds, whether they're driving the market or responding to the market, all of those things are considerations to balance. And most developers believe they are responding to their markets, which are highly localized. Again, whatever is occurring in the national marketplace. Um, what's interesting is while greenfield development has a higher risk because of the uncertainty, reinvesting inside redevelopment settings is often more costly and has its own set of risks. Many of those risks take the form of this so-called public-private partnership where the local governments may be contributing and also at the same time trying to extract certain things. Um, we believe, if we're free thinkers, that development decisions should always be fair and predictable, but at the same time, our local governments don't necessarily want to lose control. We want to encourage citizen participation, and that's often a role that we take on as planners, is helping to orchestrate and manage that citizen participation. I find it not to be a task that I personally have any interest in, despite whatever other experiences are represented by people on this call. As far as planners are concerned, I think we need to know different parts of the calculus that I've shared with you this afternoon to be truly effective. If we don't really understand the costs of what our decisions are, if we don't understand how different processes affect those costs, I'm not sure we're really in a position as a private sector planner to represent our client quite as effectively as we might if we really understand this stuff. Do we need to know all of it? No. But I think we need to understand at least the intersection of it, as I displayed in one of my earlier graphics. If you're on the public side, you also need to have some fundamental grasp of these things. Because when you're assembling a regulated environment, you're the first line of control. And if you can't appreciate these complexities and the issues that are associated with them, then I'm not sure you're able to do your job effectively um, as a public sector planner. That's it. Corey, I turn it over to you, however you choose to answer the questions. Yeah, I hope this has been a useful piece of information. I'm going to go back uh, to the title slide. Corey? Okay. Are there questions? Am I here on the phone by myself? No questions. We like that.
Oh, and I have a question. So being
Please.
in the public sector for about 15 years, we got a lot of what we called mom and pops and um trying to understand what or trying to communicate to them the length and the expense and be honest that, while the ROI for developing a small, apartment complex or commercial project can be lucrative. They think that, money will just be flowing in during the entitlement stage. And, when I would explain to them the cost, especially in California, uh, tentative map or design review for an apartment building, tell them you're probably going to be 150, $200,000, and they're just shocked by that. Is there anything kind of in the industry that, like a white paper or an FAQs that, you can utilize to communicate that more effectively? Has something like that ever been prepared? I'm not in the public sector anymore, but I have a lot of colleagues and they struggle with trying to communicate the, vastness of costs and everything from engineering to planning to entitlement fees, and then you get into development impact fees. Where I am, we're running about $27,000 per unit for single family in Riverside County for just impact fees. So just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, you're validating what I'm saying, but I think in fairness, these costs, these front end costs are going to be much, much higher in places like Florida and California than they're going to be. And I don't mean to pick on Mississippi, but I've had clients move here to Florida from Mississippi, and they intimate to me the process you're describing are easily addressed simply by picking up the phone and having a conversation. You're clearly not going to do that in California or Florida. No matter how well connected you are still going to have to work your way through the process. You may get more benign resistance or objections in Florida, but you still got to go through the process, and to move through that cycle is expensive. Um, at the moment, the National Association of Home Builders is telling us it's about 30% of the cost of a unit to deal with regulations. And I think it's probably fair to apply that 30% number to almost any form of development you want, with the argument that it potentially grows in proportion to the size of the project slightly, even if the percentage itself, um, let me restate that. The 30% would be a minimum regardless of the size of the project. It probably starts to creep up a little bit as the project gets larger and gets more complex. I don't know that there's an easy explanation. The oddity is a lot of those costs are going to be allocated to technical professionals. And many of these technical professionals, not all of them, are not going to work for free. So then the costs are not only real, they require money to actually be expended. I am an expert witness in a lot of cases. I don't know who else on this call is. And as a practical matter, to illustrate this front end dilemma, I will never take an expert witness assignment on a contingency basis. I will not do it. And there's two reasons. I want to make sure I get paid. Yep, that's not the real reason. I don't want to be sitting there on the witness stand and have one of the attorneys saying, well, is your opinion predicated on somebody paying you an amount of money based on an outcome? And the answer is, for me, it's always going to be, I don't care what the judge says. I don't care what the jury says. This is my opinion, and it was paid for months ago. Now, it may be debatable as to which is the more important, the opinion that's paid for in advance or the opinion that's contingent. But I take a certain amount of comfort in not having that as a contingent matter. But I think that in part relates to the question you raised. These are large costs. You have to be diligent in representing your client. And I don't know it's easy to sell beyond what I just explained. I do think it might be more troublesome to work with a mom and pop. I accept that. And so in that regard, I don't have any advice.
No, I
That's
appreciate it. That's good information. I just actually did sign up one client that, has been in their building since the 90s and now, but unpermitted, and they finally got their comeuppance, and, are talking to them about, yeah, these are, going to be the cost for entitlement. This is the time. Average that I've experienced is about 9 to 12 months for a very small project. I've been working on a specific plan for 5 years, and it's still not done. But
Yeah. So you
those
don't really
folks
take issue.
understand what the
So
good
you don't
news.
really take issue with my chart about money going out versus coming in. I
Oh yeah,
think, yeah, if you're lucky, you'll get an investor on some of those out periods. But for the most part, that capital isn't going to be patient forever. And the more patient, the more it costs.
yep.
So
No.
the longer it stays out, the more it costs.
Appreciate
That's
your
my
wisdom and
problem.
advice. Thank you.
Anybody else? So I know we have people from Florida who have dealt with this. There were some people from California, aside from you, I guess, Adam. I mean, I think really depending on where you are. Yeah. So
Hi.
Sarah, what is your experience with this, if
Uh,
you want to share?
Hello,
Um,
Owen. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh,
oh, go ahead, Luke.
Oh, you go ahead. Go ahead.
So my career has mostly been in commercial real estate, working directly with developers. So I'm intimately familiar with all of this. I'm also a licensed broker, and I'm in process of getting my CPA. Um, there's many opportunities, but to address some of those front end costs, especially for a smaller mom and pop. But a lot of what I have found is, especially with the smaller developers and smaller groups, is they don't necessarily want to take on partnerships or kind of syndication opportunities, because that brings on like a whole other level of governance and hassle and headache that they're just not familiar with. So there are
right,
options
right.
in terms of financing. It's just not something that people immediately gravitate or like, because now you have to answer to other people. But yes, I mean, I myself run into the front end issues also, Adam. And I'm not too far from Riverside. I'm actually in Chino, so I'm like right next door. But yeah, it's definitely an issue. I think from a planning perspective, because I've spent most of my professional and educational career kind of dissecting the real estate market and not only the cycles, but all the players and everything. So I really appreciate those infographics you put in your slides, Owen, because it can get very convoluted and people may not understand all the different players. But for me, where I see planning to kind of really get involved is in how we address the land use regulations. I find that a lot of it is too restrictive, and that creates issues in the market to be able to respond to needs in the community. But I also see an opportunity where if we just had more kind of federal support to help fund some infrastructure and embed in those the grants and the funding opportunities requirements for higher density, I think we could tackle a lot more of the housing and kind of general planning issues, you know, like greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera, kind of simultaneously. But that's just my perspective.
Can you see my screen? I mean, I don't know who's had experience with this. Um, there is a market difference in how you get from 10 to 15 units to an acre to 150 units or more per acre. And I do want to emphasize is our zoning maps don't necessarily accord to the structure type itself. And did I understand you say, Sarah, you're studying for your CPA? You
I
want to be an
am.
accountant? Okay, so I was with one of the big eight firms in the real estate practice. So I've been there. If that wasn't clear, I mean, so you obviously understand, tax situations. So going from low density to low medium density is going to push me into the next tax bracket, if you will. And I don't want to be in the next tax bracket unless I can maximize the benefits of being in that bracket. So um, I don't want the zoning code rewritten for me that if I reduce my parking, I can get 7 bonus units and get 25 units to an acre. I don't want that. If it means I'm going to have to do, I mean, I don't want it I'm sorry, I don't want to be at 35 units an acre and have them give me 5 more acres if it means I have to go to wood and concrete instead of wooden surface. So I don't want to be in that marginal situation. And I think a lot of our regulators don't necessarily understand that. And certainly these are expressed in range because they're not hard and fast. But I think if the planners only understood this one chart and what the substantive issues associated with it, they may go, wow, this is enlightening. So that's why I wanted to come back to this. I'm sorry. So Lou, you had a question or a comment, please.
Yes, well, actually, it's not a really question. It's just since I have been out of the country for the last 20 years, so I'm trying to understand what the current situation. You're talking about private development most time. Oh, someone wants to talk? Roger.
I didn't hear.
Lou, I think you've been given the floor. I'm not sure what happened. So I think that was an
All right. Okay. Oh, let me continue. I've been out of the country for the last 20 years, so I can kind of out of the context somehow. I wondered what the public, if there are still any public housing developments around. If there are, if the public housing, no
No.
public.
So if you're in the accounting world, we're going to have to wrap this up because we're running out of time. But in the accounting world that I live in and Sarah is entering, 1986 changed the world. Is we went
Yes.
from public housing to what's called tax credit apartments.
Right.
And without belaboring that, that's kind of become the norm for truly affordable housing. And from the federal standpoint, local governments and state governments contribute in other ways, but the fundamental structure around low income housing and low income housing tax credits pretty much defines how things get built. And at least as far as the word grants as a word in vocabulary, that's not a financial option for anybody anymore. That's just kind of a hopeful thought process. And if a grant is what's necessary to make something work, it's probably never going to happen. Corey is reminding me that we're out of time. I don't know who needs to thank everybody for being here. I will thank everybody and then pitch it back to Corey. I think my final word would be this. Obviously, you have a lot of resources that were on this call, several that probably have way more experience doing particular things than I do, many who have at least a different point of view than I do. And I think it's good to access that. You're certainly welcome to call me if you like. I encourage that. I think what you would walk away, I hope you would walk away with an understanding that there are fundamental things you do need to understand as a planner, so that you can have some of these, oh yeah, kind of moments as you think about what you're doing. And I hope you'll also realize that an hour, I guess we've really spent about 45 minutes discussing these issues, is barely a blink of an eye. I mean, each of these topics that were even on a slide are themselves 3 weeks worth of class time in the typical real estate class. So with that, I pass the baton back to my friend Corey, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Owen.
Thank you very much, Owen. We really appreciate it. Vince, as the chair of the Professional Development Committee, did you want to close out with anything?
I just wanted to echo the remarks that you and Owen made and thank everyone for their participation. And if you have the opportunity, drop us a line on your thoughts on the program so that we can continually improve and provide the best product that we can for not only our members, but for people who are in other divisions or just members of APA. So we hope that you really enjoyed the opportunity and to be with us today. And we thank you for taking time on a Friday afternoon to be with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.